before I forget. Okay, so what was I saying? Oh, if you guys have personal questions about your grade, come and see me. Your overall score right now is a little bit distorted because of the study plan. So I just put in another call to Pearson, and I'll see. You can still check your overall homework score and test score, so you can kind of get a ballpark of where you're at. But I'm going to make some modification there one way or the other, but I just put in a call to my Pearson rep to see where they're at with that, because she agreed that it shouldn't be working the way it is, or they hope to change it.
All the time, right? No, they are.
The study plan?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
The study plan, so the question was, is the study plan open all semester? And the answer is yes. So the study plan's just sitting there. You can go in and gobble up those points, even after you've done your test attempts, if you want to go get those. I sent that email about, the relative weight of one little study plan question. Anybody remember what percent of your grade it turned out to be? 0.25 or something like that, but it was a fraction of a percent. So in other words, if you don't feel like getting the study plan point, one stinking point, it's not a huge part of your grade. And you can go back later on if you wanted to gobble them up if you're kind of at a bubble breaker, if you're right on the break line of an A or a B or something. Then you can go back and get those later if you wanted to. Okay, any other questions there? So, if you have these sheets, why don't you pull them out? We're going to be working on these a little bit here for starters. So, again, this is our market system in a nutshell for the nation. Come on, baby. Zoom in, find it, there we go. Oh, maybe. It's probably the little plastic covers screwing it up. Okay, so there it is. Resource market, final goods and services market, right? Supply and demand curve up there, supply and demand curve down here. The exchange going on down here is that the households own all of the resources. What resources? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. They are supplying that to these businesses. Businesses are in turn paying them wages, rents, interest, profits, etc. So that's the resource market, or the factor market, factors of production. And then up top, we have goods and services being provided to households in exchange for money that they spent on their consumer spending. And so this week's material has a couple different parts. Chapter 5, we're going to look at government intervention in the marketplace. And then chapter 8, I'm sorry, I said 5, 6, sorry. Chapter 6 is government intervention. And then we skip chapter 7, remember, so if you happen to be reading through, don't do chapter 7. And then we'll go to chapter 8, which is on consumer choice and preferences. So today we're going to spend our time looking at the government's involvement in the marketplace. And so this next picture kind of shows how the government works into the two primary markets. And so there's a whole bunch of new arrows going on. On your sheet, I actually don't have it here. We also have these some public goods going on, but we want to kind of track the flows. So how does the government earn money? They earn money through taxation in the two markets. So I want to start with how the government collects money. If you look at the flow up here, we have dollars going to Walmart, but then all of a sudden some of that money gets derailed to the White House, right? So the money that we spend at Walmart, part of that gets derailed to the White House. What do we call that type of tax? Sales tax, right? So it's a tax on consumption is kind of the weird way an economist might look at that. It's a tax on consumption, or the sales taxes. So Walmart doesn't receive all that money. Ultimately, they rebate some of it back to the White House, and that's our flow of what I'm calling T2 coming in here. The other source of tax revenue is down here. The businesses cut you guys a big fat paycheck, but part of that paycheck gets derailed through T1 up to the White House. What do we call that kind of tax? Income tax, right? So the government is collecting some taxes here in the resource market. They're also collecting some taxes in the final goods and services market. Those are the only two sources that they have here for flows in the economy. So T1 and T2 give you kind of a framework of how the government fits into the system with their taxes. All right, questions or comments there? All right, where do they spend their money? Well, we got G1, G2, and G3. So G1 shows the government coming up to the goods market and buying stuff like weapons of mass destruction, right? Where do they get those things? Where do they get their ammunition? Well, they go to Guns R Us, some hopefully American-made company, but not necessarily. They go to a company and they say, hey, I'll buy $1 million worth of ammo. Ship it off to me, right? So they went to the store, just like you guys go to the store for ammunition. The government goes to the store for ammunition, and they spend that money. So one type of government spending, G1, is when the government goes up into the goods market. The government might also shop at Walmart for toilet paper for President Obama's royal throne, right? So that's another source of spending in the output market. So we got weapons of mass destruction, toilet paper, and then thousands of other things, right? But I've just got two of them off the top of my head of what the government goes for there. Then the government also spends some money here, G2, in hiring people to work for it. We call those people bureaucrats. So in government, we have elected officials, politicians, and then we have people who work for the government. We call them bureaucrats. They kind of handle some of the paper shuffling and stuff like that, right? So they're just employees of the government. And so they buy those resources. They might also buy some computers for the White House and some other things, right? So the government comes into the resource market and purchases some of the land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Probably not so much on the entrepreneurship part, but we have a flow of some of those resources coming to the White House in exchange for payments for those things. Those payments might be a paycheck for a government employee, but not too fast. The government employee has to pay a little bit of income tax too before they get their income after taxes, right? Which economists call disposable income, the amount of money that you're going to have left over for your own spending. And then you take that money and you go spend it somewhere else. All right. Last little bit of spending is what I call the Robin Hood type spending. So G3 is transfers. So we have all kinds of transfer payments. In fact, it's something that I've done some research on and written some papers and presented papers on, is how much that has been in the last 20 years. So right now, for every $100 of taxes that you pay the government, $70 is going in the form of a transfer payment. So what's a transfer payment? Take from the rich, give to the poor. Take from the young, give to the old. Anybody know what we call that program? Take from the young, give to the old. Social Security is take from the young, give to the old. Take from the employed, give to the unemployed. Right? So that one's not welfare. That's the unemployment insurance that's on your paycheck. So part of the taxes they collect is unemployment insurance, which you'll get to collect if you became unemployed, right? So you'll get to collect some of that. It's what they call some sort of insurance policy. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of government, it's just a transfer. There's not like a big retirement fund that the government's taking your young people's money and investing it somewhere. It is literally in from you, out to the old fart. In, out. It doesn't get parked into Wall Street, into a mutual fund or something. It's literally a transfer from one person to the next. And government spending, 70% of government spending now is that form. And then you do have welfare programs and those other sorts of programs all make up, in general, transfer payments. Okay, so we got spending, weapons of mass destruction, toilet paper. We got spending on resources, employees, and computers. And then we've got transfer payments. All right? So those are the basic, kind of covers in 3 categories the ways that government spends money. They collect money at the cash register, they collect money on income, and they try to fund that stuff. So a little extra bonus question. Do they currently collect enough money to pay for all of the G's?
No.
No. So they run what we call a budget deficit, right? And we currently have a national debt that's getting bigger and bigger because each year they're running a deficit. They're not collecting enough taxes to pay for the spending. All right, that's a little bit more macro-ish than we'll get into in micro, but it is important when we get to the budgeting chapter, the next chapter 8, where you guys at a micro level are doing the same thing. You earn your paycheck and you do some spending with it, right? And if you spend more than you make, then you're taking on debt or you got a gift from somebody. Okay, questions on the flyby here. All right, so I have a little video that, this is the first time I've ever showed it. This is a new video that came up. And there's 5 episodes. And let's see, it's 3, 2, 1. So it's called Love Gov. Has anybody heard it? Heard of this video? Or seen them? All right, so the gist of the story, just so you kind of got the context, is that it's a boyfriend-girlfriend situation, and the boyfriend's name is Gov. And so then we kind of go through their relationship together with Gov and his girlfriend. So here's the start of it. We're just going to watch number 1 today, but I plan on kind of working through these.
Are you spying on that lady?
No. Protecting her.
Who?
Herself.
Sure looks like you're spying on her.
Shouldn't we be in school or something?
I'm homeschooled.
Of course you are. Wear a helmet.
Your mom says I don't have to.
Well, your mom sounds like a real idiot.
Anything I can do? Idiot. Not an idiot, Alexis. You're trusting. Just so happens you trusted someone it was idiotic to trust. You seemed like such a sweet guy at first.
So sorry. I will buy you all new books.
Well, that seems wasteful, but help me pick them up.
Of course.
Thanks.
Gov. Kavinsky, Scott Kavinsky, but everybody calls me Gov.
I'm Alexis.
Sweet.
So, do you work here?
Unofficially.
What does that mean?
Well, they don't really pay me for asking me to come. I just like to come down here for a couple hours every day and I'll throw in my 2 cents. Seems like everybody needs to be told what to do. Now, officially, I'm a student, a 6th-year senior.
What are you studying?
Poli-sci, engineering, economics, education, and nursing.
That's incredible. What are you going to do with all of that?
Everything. I really want to make the world a better place. Well, just not Iran.
Ready, Lexi? Hey. Can I have those back?
Student withdrawal form. Are you dropping out?
No. I don't know. Maybe. I'm already 15 grand in debt and I still have 2 more years to go. Plus, I kind of have a business now. Alexis is an amazing artist. last summer I taught myself how to build a website for her, and now she's kicking butt selling her shirts and bags online. And I'm making real money, not made up internet money or something. It just seems like a better idea to focus on that rather than going deeper into debt, getting a degree that won't even help us get a job. Look, I made a chart of cost versus benefits. I like charts.
Who is that?
She's my friend Libby.
Education is priceless. I think it's pretty crass to bring up money when we're talking about your future. You're getting a great deal here. The facilities, the faculty, world-class administration. My dorm has an Olympic-sized pool.
With all the easy money handed out to students, the university has no incentive to cut costs. And every year they spend more. You can see about it here.
Don't let information get in the way of learning. I thought studying wrong.
Definitely not. This program's like twice as expensive as a regular semester.
And twice as fun. Seriously, where do you want to go? I know people in every country. They'll take it with a grain of salt what they say about me.
Oh, would love to go to Italy.
Right?
The food, the art, total Michelangelo fangirl. The artists, not the Ninja Turtle. Oh, both.
There is a summer semester in Florence. Do it. Do it. Do it.
What's this? You don't have the money for this.
That's what loans are for. You don't have the money for it. Sounds like somebody needs an education. Look, I know some people. If I vouch for you, he can definitely get you the money that you need. Maybe even a little extra.
You can do that.
Look, I know you just met Alexis, but you care too much. But more than you care about yourself. And I don't want anything to come between you and the education that you desire.
I would love to go to Florence.
Sir.
But you already have so much debt to pay. How will going to Italy help with that?
You're going to have a lifetime to pay off that. A lifetime. But your education opportunities are right now. There's nothing more important than your education. Except maybe corn farmers.
All right, so that gives our little taste here of some fun we'll keep looking at. So there's 5 of those short clips. They're all just about 5 minutes long, so we'll kind of try to work through some of those. So how does the government get involved as far as supply and demand is our next topic here. So we're going to look at various situations of government intervention in the free market and then analyze the impact of that. So we're going to get used to writing our home base here. So let me start off with types of government intervention. So the first one we're going to take, what's that?
Chapter 6, right?
This is chapter 6, yeah. So the first one we're going to look at is a tax. What happens when the government creates a tax? Number 2, what happens if the government creates a subsidy? The opposite of a tax. Instead of taking money, they're going to give money out. Number 3, we get into price controls. We'll first look at a price ceiling. Then we'll look at a price floor. All right, and then we'll see how things go. We'll get into some other combinations. You know, what do regulations do to the market? We can also look at a quota, which is a restriction on quantity. So I just kind of want to get the list down here of different things we'll take a peek at. And then they can do some combos. Combos of everything, or not, we won't look at everything, but we'll look at some special cases. So that's kind of my game plan here. And we'll start off with number one, a tax. Now, these can come in a couple different varieties. We're going to be looking at a per unit tax for simplicity. But a lot of times we have an ad valorem tax. This is a Latin word that means according to value. And that's the way we normally face the cash register. If you go run to Walmart today, what are they going to hit you with at the cash register? What kind of tax? And sales tax of what amount? About 9%, yeah. It might be higher here than where you're from, but how many Olathe people do we have that it's higher than 9%? Olathe, Overland Park, how high? 13. Yeah, there's a couple little pockets. Davis, oh, you were going to talk?
Yeah, I was going to say I got 12%, but yeah.
You got 12%. Okay, so, and where are you from? Davis?
Vancouver, BC.
Vancouver, okay. So, Vancouver, 12%. So, but even in Overland Park, different areas of town, depending on where the store is at, you can still be in the city of Overland Park, and some things at the mall will run higher than another spot, which kind of blew me away. We didn't, for the most part, have that too much in Iowa. It was mostly by city. But here they've carved up little pockets of special areas. So, yeah, what I've seen in Kansas, they can run, who's got the low on Kansas? Wyandotte, do you know how much? I mean, and this is, by the way, between state, there's a couple things piled on top of each other. State tax is the same everywhere in Kansas. And then there's local option sales taxes is where we get into these little extras. So usually 9% is about right for a lot of places in Kansas.
Tax on top of the city tax.
Oh, they have it right inside the store even? Yeah, it was probably due to some incentives.
They asked if they could.
Yeah, they probably got some additional money up front to build the store, to come there or something, is how that generally works. All right, so that's according to value. You can think of this being a percent of value. And I just like to bring that up so that you know the effects of each graphically are very similar, but it's a little bit easier for the principles of economics student to handle the per unit tax. So it's going to be like $1 per unit, for instance. So for example, $1 per unit, rather than 8% or 9%. Graphically, it's a little bit easier. So that's one of the reasons we do it that way. But the effect is the same. It's just a little less complicated to calculate. Okay, so let's see. Let's just jump right into a graph. So we're going to start off with home base with each one of these. So upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. We do a little P star and Q star, if you want to call it Q1 and P1 or whatever. So this is the idea of the free market, no government intervention at this point. We'd expect the market to get to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now there's a couple ways to think about the tax. If the government all of a sudden introduces a tax on the producer, and let's say that we're currently at $10 per unit. What's our good today? We did golf balls before. Give me something, go. Baseballs, the first thing I heard. All right, so we got quantity of baseball, so $10 a baseball. If the government says, hey, we need to collect more money, and so sellers of baseballs, you now have to pay $1. We're going to tax you $1, right? So the government runs $1. What are they going to do if they were currently selling on average 100 baseballs a day at $10 per baseball? What are they going to do tomorrow after the legislation passes? How much does that baseball cost? 11, right? They're just going to try to tack it on. Oh, no big deal. We'll just add that. We'll just add that on. And so you can kind of think about at the current quantity, they're going to add on that dollar, right? And if they add it on to 100 units, they'd add it on to any units because it's a per unit tax, right? So if they happened at 50 units, the cost, remember the supply curve being the marginal cost curve? The cost of the 50th unit was this amount. Now it's going to be a buck higher. The government's socking us with a buck. A buck, 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 a buck. And we've effectively moved the supply curve up by the amount of $1 all the way across the board. So this is the supply curve with the tax, with the per unit tax. So make sure you put supply curve with the tax. It's not the real supply curve. I like to call it the fake supply curve because ultimately the company's not going to get all of that money. Now, when they put the price of $11, as you guys said, when they put the price of $11 tomorrow when the store opens, do they sell the 100 units just like they did before? No. Why? Because they're more expensive for who? The consumer, right? And so the law of demand told us that if there's an increase in the price of the good, what happens to the quantity demanded? It goes down. And the demand curve here shows that information, that they're going to reduce their purchases back down to some level. You didn't have to make this kind of lines up with my 50 for some reason, but I didn't have to. If you guys want to pick a different one, it doesn't matter. The main thing here is we want to show that we're no longer going to be selling 100. What is this now? What's going on in the marketplace? What did we learn in chapter 3? A surplus, right? So now the business has got extra baseballs sitting on their shelves. When they open their doors tomorrow, what might they need to do to get rid of the excess inventory? Lower the price, right? How low do they need to go to get rid of the surplus? Well, that's what this little thing tells us right here. The fake supply curve, I'll get back to why I'm calling it the fake supply curve, shows us that at this price, there will be no more surplus. And I guess just for argument's sake here, let's call that $10.50 if this was I guess I didn't even say it was a dollar tax, but I was thinking of a dollar tax here. So this is the price the consumer pays. So P subscript C, the price that the consumer pays, and now there's no more surplus. Now the reason I called it the fake supply curve is because what is the amount that the producer actually receives? If the new price is $10.50 in order to get rid of the surplus, what do they end up getting? Not 10, $9.50 because they got to pay the tax. So at this price, the government, or at $10.50, the amount that the producer is getting is actually minus the dollar, which brings us right back to the original supply curve. Because this vertical height was equal to the dollar, and so now we've got the producer getting $9.50, or PP, the price that the producer receives.
Now, is that if the producer is directly selling the baseballs to customers, or does that include going through an actual producer selling to a business from the business to the customer?
No, this is just final goods market. Yep, final product. So ultimately, the story kind of goes here is that naturally they say, oh, sorry consumers, the price is 11 now. but consumers won't buy all those at 11. So what's the lesson being learned here about taxes? Even if we tax the big bad corporation, because they're just nasty, greedy, profit-making capitalists, if we tax them, what happens? You still end up paying for it, right? That's the huge, huge lesson in economics that you guys really need to see for yourself, is that ultimately, after the dust settles, taxes will always be shared by both the consumer of the product and the producer of the product. They will end up sharing the tax. Unless you're building $1 million stadium, no, I would argue even if you're building $1 million stadium. Now there is there's going to be one special case that we'll talk about later, but in general, that's true.
So even because of taxes, they don't even sell it.
Because of taxes, they don't sell as many as they could have, right? So here's the next part. I think that's what you're getting at, is that the quantity after the tax, QT, is something less than what we were at before. So I know we're starting to get a little clogged up here, and I'll try to clean things up here in a little bit. Just making up numbers, let's just call this 80 units, okay? Wherever, don't worry about the scaling so let's just call that 80 units. So now there's 20 less units being traded, if you will, between consumers and producers because of the tax. What is this rectangle? The area of this rectangle turns out meaning something. What is that? The amount the government gets. Good. How do you know that? That's right. Yeah, they're paying their share. So what was going on? In fact, using these numbers, how much is the government getting? $80. How did you get that? 80 times 1. It happened to be $1. Might have been a little better if I would have had a $2 tax. Then we would have had 160. But we've got the area of this rectangle is not half of base times height. That was for the triangle we did last week. But base times height, right? The base is the amount being exchanged now, 80, times the height, which is the amount of the per unit tax. So this vertical distance here represents the per unit tax equal to $1. The little triangle is government revenue, tax revenue, collected from the tax, which is equal to little t of $1 times QT, the 80. And so in this case, we get $1 times 80 units equals $80. So the government's collecting $80 of tax revenue from this tax. All right. Any other questions here? What do you guys got?
What's the number next to Q?
Next to the Q here, T, little t.
Oh.
Little t is the tax rate of $1 per unit. Any other questions like that? Please just, don't ever hesitate if you can't see something I got written on the board. So little t times big QT gives you the amount of tax revenue. All right, now, just to kind of motivate, since I brought up the tax thing, sometimes consumers get taxed, right? So if we thought about this, instead of taxing the big bag corporation, if we tax the consumer, I'm just going to do golf club only maneuver here. If the consumer was currently paying $10, their demand now is $1 less at each price. And so the tax still looks the same. We shifted the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. The new fake demand curve intersects the old supply curve right at QT. The price that the producer gets, the price that the consumer pays is all the same. So again, it's just to kind of further the point of it doesn't matter who you tax. If you kind of tax the consumer or if you tax the producer, ultimately, after the dust settles, they're going to share the tax burden. All right. Let me write some of this out. We can catch up here. So PC equals the price consumers pay. PP, price producers receive. Little t is the per unit tax. Big T, which I didn't even write here, but big T is usually total tax revenue or government revenue, and that's equal to little t times QT, which we already showed was the green rectangle. QT is the quantity after the tax. After the tax is imposed, we get QT. And then you guys hopefully already know the free market original. I won't rewrite those. Equilibrium price and quantity without the government in there. An alternative way to think about this, sometimes this is a technique I prefer, is called the tax wedge. And so if we think about this vertical height, in fact, let me just put on here, I guess, quickly, alternative way to think about it. Always good practice to get home base down anyway. And there's Q star, there's P star, there's price. An alternative way to think about the tax is to measure off the amount of the tax and think about that on the scale here. So again, if this is, let me just make this $20. And then we have a $1, $2, $3, $4 tax. So the height of the eraser here is the amount of the $4. And then we're going to take our little tax wedge and we're going to float it in, staying below the demand curve and above the supply curve. And it just comes floating in here. Don't mind me, I'm just the government. Until it gets wedged in there. And where it gets wedged identifies QT. The top part of the wedge touches the demand curve telling you PC, and the bottom part touches the supply curve telling you the price producers receive. So when I did it this way, notice I didn't put in the fake supply curve. Get to the same spot though. And that's called the tax wedge. So I think sometimes conceptually this might help you. Other times you might be easier to think about it this way. At the end of the day, you get to the same spot.
So it'll always be above.
Yes, there'll be, because it's creating a wedge between here, the consumer's price will be above the equilibrium price. And producers will be below. All right. Any other comments clarifications. So this then lends itself to the tax burden. Who bears the burden of the tax? Let's leave that as a question mark. Who bears the burden of the tax? And who does in this case? Who bears the burden of the tax? Producers and consumers. And we can even quantify that. There was $80 worth of tax revenue. How much of that tax revenue was paid by consumers? Half. It turned out to be exactly half here. $40 of it was paid by the consumers because their price went from 10 to 10.50. They paid 50 cents of the load, if you will. And producers' price got reduced effectively down to 9.50, so they paid 50 cents of the load. So in this case, we had the burden of taxation split evenly. So if I take this box and I think about the top half and the bottom half differently, the top half represents the consumer's burden of the tax, the bottom half represents the producer's burden of the tax. So let's write that down. Who bears the burden of the tax? Let me get, there's one more formula that I could put somewhere here, but with our example, PC equals 1050, and P star without the government involved equals 10. Therefore, the consumer burden is equal to $40. The extra 50 cents, I'll write it out if I'm going to put it out. The extra 50 cents, 0.5 cents times the 80 units gives me $40 of payment from the consumers. The producer price was equal to $9.50, and of course, pre-tax it was 10. Therefore, the producer burden is equal to the 50 cents times the 80 units gives me 40 bucks. Let's catch up with that. This is times, little dot, 50 cents times the 80 units. Now, is it always going to be equal? No, that's the correct answer. A little more difficult to see. What determines who pays more? Not the amount of tax. So let me just play off your thing first of all. If the tax was bigger, then this wedge would get taller, right? So if this was the tax, we'd still be 50-50 split, okay? So it's not if it's bigger. Type of tax? No. Supply and demand curve, what about them? How they're angled, very good. What do we call about how they're angled? What's the fancy word we learned in chapter 4? The elasticity. Now, through the magic of the golf club, if we take this demand curve and we start to make it steeper, which means it's more inelastic, what happens to the burden of the tax? It gets shifted onto the consumer, right? Now, this is where I think it might be easier to look at this graph with the tax wedge. Remember how the whole okay, keep that in mind. As I where's my do-to-doer? As I start to make this steeper, and I do my little do-to-do, what's happening to the producer price when I finally get wedged in there? It's getting higher, and the consumer price is also getting higher. So then the difference between the original $10 and the new consumer price is a bigger difference, right? So the elasticity of demand in this case is going to play a role. Now, it's not just the elasticity of demand, though. It's also the elasticity of supply. Because if I start to do this with this curve, but at the same time make this one steeper too, what happens to the tax burden if I make them equally steep, if you will? It stays the same, right? So as I start to make these steeper, running out of room here, I got such a little diagram, it's possible that they could be still equal burden, right? If I do the little do-to-do. Now what's happening to QT if I make them both steeper, even keeping the burden equal? It's increasing, yeah. So QT is actually going up. In other words, the wedge is starting to float further this way, which is increasing QT. Now, if we have one of those extreme econ examples where demand, like maybe for cocaine in a local market, is almost perfectly inelastic, or maybe it's marijuana in Colorado, which is completely legal now. If the demand for marijuana happened to be perfectly inelastic, and the government comes in and imposes a tax, who pays the tax? The consumer pays all of it, right? So the marijuana growers won't pay it at all if the demand is perfectly inelastic. The consumer will end up bearing the full burden of the tax. On the flip side, if the supply curve, let's say demand for marijuana looks like this, but the supply curve is perfectly elastic. Who bears the burden of the tax now? So be careful here. As I start to rotate this through, what's happening? It's the consumer still, right? I float my little tax wedge in, staying below the demand curve, above the supply curve, What happened to QT? It went down, right? So at the end of the day, it's the elasticity of supply relative to the elasticity of demand, or vice versa. One relative to the other is what determines the burden of the tax. Let me write some of that out. Who bears the burden of the tax? Under this example, it turned out this way, but, big but, they don't always share it. But it is not always shared equally. The burden, let me go move over here. I'll just get rid of this. The burden of the tax, the share, depends on the elasticity of demand relative to the elasticity of supply. The shares of the tax burden depend on the relative elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. One relative to the other. Just for fun, we can kind of crank out some scenarios here. Suppose we got a demand curve that looks like this with a regular old supply curve. Suppose we got a pretty steep supply curve and a regular old demand curve. And then let's see what else we got. How about a relatively flat demand curve and some sort of supply curve? Just make sure that your slopes are different. It really doesn't matter, just to kind of illustrate this point. Draw in your initial equilibrium price and quantity. And then this time, when you do the tax for this example, be really obnoxious. Like the government's just way out of line. They're charging a huge tax just to show the tax burden so that we don't get so tiny on our paper. So I'm going to use the edge of my eraser. So the height of the tax is darn near over half of the price of the good, but that's okay, just to kind of show the point here. We float in until it gets wedged in there. We get wedged in there. And finally, staying below the demand curve, above the supply curve, we get wedged in there. The top part of the wedge touches the demand curve, telling you which price? The consumer's price, PC. The bottom part of the wedge touches the supply curve, telling you PP. And then if you make it obnoxious enough, it's easy to see, right? The burdens just pop out at you here that under this scenario, with a steep demand curve and a regular old supply curve, those marijuana users are going to bear the bigger burden of the tax. And then, of course, don't forget about QT, the quantity after the tax. And then just do the same thing for each one. Top part is PP. Or PC rather, the consumer price. The bottom part is the producer price. When the supply curve is relatively inelastic compared to demand, the producers now are going to pick up the paycheck here. They're going to pick up the tax. The burden of the tax is going to fall more to them. A really elastic response, if the marijuana situation looks like this, where consumers have an elastic demand. By the way, speaking of marijuana, what would this suggest? If the real elasticity of demand for marijuana looked like this, what are you starting to see as a principles of economics student? You know, what is that consumer doing? If it's really elastic, what are they doing when there's a increase in price of pot? What are they doing? I'll give you a hint. Instead of smoking pot, they're drinking or meth or cocaine or heroin or, all right, we can go right down the list, right? So if there's lots of substitutes substitutes available, we learned that a lot of substitutes will cause the elasticity of demand to be relatively flat. And so the availability of substitutes, if there's legal alternatives like alcohol compared to maybe some of the other illegal opportunities, then that's all going to play a role in how effective this program is for the government. One of the reasons they might like to legalize pot is to collect tax revenue. What can we spend that tax revenue money on? Education of how bad pot can be for you, right? So that might be one thing we can do. So we can spend some money on education. So should we legalize it or not? Does making it legal make a whole bunch of people start smoking pot? They're like, oh man, now that it's legal, thank God.
Yeah.
Whew, I was just going to drink, but now I'm going to smoke lots of pot. Do you think there's a lot of people in that category?
Yeah.
You know, how hard is it to get pot? Not hard at all, right? So it's important to look at the status quo with applying the proper policy. I think what people did is looked at the current pot usage, and it's like, well, dang, everybody's getting high. So how can we make the status quo better if we think A, either getting high is not so good of a thing, or B, we'd like to spend money on campaigns to educate our youth that they shouldn't be smoking pot, but we don't have any money in the government. So maybe, bingo, here's an idea. We could legalize it and tax it. What do these graphs tell you will be the effects on the consumption of pot when it's legalized? Will it go up or down? Down. QT is less in all of these cases. Even when it looks a little differently, there's less consumption of the good at the margin. The more inelastic it gets, the less of effect that has. However, the tax revenue effect is still fairly large. Even when it's more inelastic, the QT effect is actually a little bit bigger. And so we'll collect more money as long as less people choose not to do it. Now, if they go spend that money on stupid stuff, that's a whole different story, right? But there's an argument to be made if we can beef up drug enforcement agencies, if we can beef up education to the youth, if we can do all of that stuff, a lot of economists would argue it's a victimless crime. If you want to go damage your brain cells, A, you're probably going to do it anyway, whether it's legal or illegal. Well, let's just legalize it and tax it. Now we've got something to kind of roll with here a little bit, perhaps, in fighting the drug war, if you will. So, is everybody ready to walk out of here and support pot legalization in Kansas? This has been kind of on the board. Or do we still have some that just doesn't seem right with you? No, my mom, no, that's bad stuff. That's bad stuff. Oh, kind of fun discussions. I bet you didn't think we were going to hit pot in the econ class today, did you? So here we go. We're talking drugs. And so any questions or comments? All right. So that hits taxes. If you're still a little foggy, when we do subsidies, it's going to look very similar. So let's hit the subsidy next. How many of you are receiving a subsidy today to be in the seats that you're in? Subsidies, government subsidy. Anybody getting a government grant? Okay, government grant is a subsidy. So the government's giving you money to try to encourage you to come to school. So lots of students end up getting some subsidies each year. This is one example. So subsidy is government spending money. government spending money on a particular good or service or activity. So one of our key examples would be education. And let's go ahead and draw home base. Downward sloping demand, you don't have to make it extra flat or anything, but just kind of regular home base here. P star and Q star, there we go, there's the free market and all its glory, all the benefits that we have from it. So is the idea of a subsidy to encourage or discourage the activity? Encourage, right? So immediately you should be thinking we're going to have the effect drifting this way. With a tax, it may or may not have been the intent, but it tended to discourage the activity, right? And so the government finds it a little easier to tax sin goods. It's called kind of a sin tax because those good Christians thought that drinking was bad. So let's tax alcohol. Who all is in favor of an alcohol tax? Oh, that's good. That's a sin anyway. Those guys can pay it, right? So it's called a sin tax. It's all the good fun stuff in life, cigarettes and now marijuana and all of those tend to be goods that the government tax on extra taxes on top of what you guys see at the cash register. So that tends to be a good place because if the demand for alcohol or tobacco is relatively inelastic, the quantity effect is pretty small. And so that ends up being an easier way politically to pass something by than some other things. So on the flip side, on the subsidy, we're going to encourage production or consumption. And so I'm going to do the old tax wedge method. Now that it's a subsidy, you're going to start from the right side and float your boat in, staying below the supply curve and above the demand curve, until it gets wedged in again, just like before. And so the amount of the per unit subsidy is the height of that. So it's really kind of a negative tax. So that is the per unit subsidy, little s. The alternative way, this time I gave you the tax wedge method first, but the alternative way is to think about, oh, here's me, I'm thinking about going to Ottawa University, and if there's no government involved with it, then this reflects my prices I'm willing to pay for education. And if the government all of a sudden gives me some money, I can afford to pay more. So it's going to shift the demand curve up by the amount of the per unit subsidy. Here we go with the fake demand curve. The government has artificially pumped up the demand through giving people free money for that activity. That causes the new price to be higher, but not for everybody. The consumer's not paying that price ultimately, but it is the price that Ottawa University is getting. So the top part of the wedge, or where the demand with the subsidy intersects, is here. And that ends up being now P or C? PP. We flipped it around on you because remember, the top part of the wedge is touching the supply curve. Ottawa University is now enjoying a higher price than what they would have got in the free market. The consumer, though, you guys, you're not paying that $25,000 a year tuition, right? That's almost a joke in a number of ways. Lots of scholarships and grants and activities, and so lots of things going on, so that the consumer price is PEP minus the subsidy gives you the consumer price. What's the area of this rectangle? Yeah, a little more detail. You're right. I got the per unit subsidy as the edge or the height here. By the way, I didn't put in QS as the quantity after the subsidy. Remember, we were trying to encourage education because we thought that that was a good thing for people in society. Having smarter people running around rather than dumber people makes sense for the economy for some reason. Less crime, people stealing stuff, and society seems like a better place if we have more education rather than less. So we're going to encourage education. We bump out to QS. What's this rectangle equal to? So I just want a little more detail on the subsidy. Profit is getting closer, but we don't have a business involved here. Or we do, I'm sorry, we do have a business involved, but it's not the profit from them, but it's somebody else's money. What'd you say, Keith? Per unit subsidy is the height. What I want is, what's this? The area of that rectangle. How much the government pays. It's total government spending. What was it over here? Government revenue. Right, so it was the other thing at the top of the hour when I went over all the flows, the T's and the G's. This is tax revenue. This is government spending. It is potentially, they take from the rich, give to the poor. A poor college student now is getting this amount of spending, or the human being who chooses to pursue their education is now being transferred money in our system. Because likely that person is not paying into the system taxes that would offset the amount of money they're getting to go to Ottawa University, right? So this now is government spending. I'll get to your question here in a sec. But this area here is government spending. And it's equal to little s times QS. I didn't use numbers this time. I don't think I will bother to clutter this up with actual numbers, but you take the amount of the subsidy times the quantity. You'll get that. Did I see a hand up?
Just looking at the two separate ones, though, it looks already like there's a deficit spending going on because of how much it looks like they make for each.
You don't have enough information to make that comment on here. So no, forget that. I just want to wipe it right out of your brain and out of your lips. Don't even go there, because all we're analyzing here is a particular market. By the way, I didn't label my markets, but let's just say education. And so for all I know, the government's collecting tons of money from other places, the cigarettes and income and sales taxes, and the government's so bloated now that they're collecting $100 million and then they're only paying out $50, right? Just to kind of make it really absurd. So don't start to confuse those two concepts. Keep them compartmentalized, that this is government spending. All right, anything else? Other comments, questions? Subsidy. All right, so it kind of worked the same way. Again, the edge of the wedge is determined by the same properties we did before. If demand was more inelastic, we'd be floating our boat up a little bit higher. Everybody see that? If we had, let me just do one. If we floated in our boat, we'd end up coming up higher, and consumers would get even more benefit. So we can talk about the the producer share and the consumer share the same way that we did with taxes. So it operates the same way, which just think of it as sometimes we think of it as a negative tax. It's just moving the opposite direction. And that's why we float our boat in this way rather than floating it in this way. Okay, good? Good for now. We're going to do a little more practice with this, so I'm not too worried if you're a little froggy yet. Number 3. Let's look at a price control called a price ceiling. A price ceiling is a maximum price. A maximum price set by law. Law of the government. A maximum price set by law. So let's draw home base again. Here's our little old free market operating just fine, allocating resources to their highest and best use. And everything seems to be going fine at P, Q, and or P star and Q star. You know, maybe this is a 3-bedroom apartment in Ottawa. Anybody know what those run roughly? Give me a number. 700? How much? 700 is fine. All right, let's go 700. So here we've got the market for 3-bedroom apartments, 3-bed rentals, if you will. Maybe it's not even apartments or houses, whatever. Well, the city government is just upset with this. It's like, jeepers, creepers, are you kidding me? $700 a month, those poor college students? We got to do something. This is outrageous. That those landlords, those landowners that are the greedy, sucking profit guys that just make tons of money, they're really sucking it to these poor college students. So let's talk to the politicians, and the politicians come up with a plan to say 3 bedrooms in Ottawa can only be sold at $600 per month. So there's going to be a ceiling by law imposed. So this is the ceiling price of $600. Principles of microeconomics students, predict for me what happens when the government steps in and imposes a price ceiling. Shortage. Right? Now you guys are getting this. You're like, oh, wait a second. Yeah, lots of people love getting cheap apartments. The quantity demanded is way out here. But at that price, we're going to find less units supplied. Maybe the day after the legislation takes place, it's not going to have a huge effect, but remember the length of time starts to allow, so that supply curve might be relatively inelastic if we evaluate supply on today. Like, how many apartments are we going to lose today? Well, none. There was 100 3-bedroom apartments. We're not going to instantly lose 300 apartments, right? But over time, we're going to see maybe different apartment units getting converted into something else. And so we might see a more elastic response over time, and that creates our quantity supplied being less than the quantity demanded, creating a shortage equal to that horizontal distance. If I was having some numbers here just for fun, just to motivate things again, you know, if this was, I don't know, 800 units, and this was 1,000, and this is now 600, we all of a sudden have a shortage of 400 units. Okay. How much tax revenue? Spending, taxes, what's the deal there with the government in the price ceiling world? Government revenue. We kind of want to start thinking about revenue effects or spending effects, just like we did with tax and subsidy. How much money is being collected or spent by the government? None. It's just a law. It says it's illegal to charge a price higher than 600. Now, as the university starts to grow, what happens to the situation? The shortage gets bigger, right? So the equilibrium price would be down here. Now, if for some reason everybody's like, man, auto sucks, I'm out of here, they got this government that's running crazy, and all of a sudden demand shifts down to here. What's the effect of the price ceiling?
Surplus.
Surplus? That's not quite right. It looks like it would be right graphically, but that's not what's going on at the market. What's the effect of the ceiling? Chisholm? It wouldn't have any effect. That's right. So if equilibrium price falls down to $400 a month through market forces, are they breaking the law by charging $400? No. So the market's going to operate just as normally it would. If the ceiling price is above the market price, it's ineffective policy. It doesn't really matter. We kind of talked a little bit about the ineffective part with the minimum wage, and we're going to do a price floor next, so I'll just leave it at that. So in order to be effective, this ends up being kind of a nice little multiple choice question that you might see. The ceiling price must be set below the market price in order to be effective. So note, to be effective, to have an impact on the market, to be effective, the ceiling price must be below the market price. I know I'm a little low for some of you guys over here, so let me know if you need it. To be effective, the ceiling price must be below the market price.
Where floor price comes into effect, say that
No, it's just an ineffective ceiling at this point. If it's above, I mean, if it's above the market price, it's just ineffective. So another way to think about it is, if the government said, hey, let's impose a ceiling of $800, does it have an effect? No, because the market's already at $700. All right, number 4. A price floor. A price floor. See, it looks like we're a little off for you guys. I know that's a little fuzzy for you, so there we go. A price floor is a minimum price set by law. To be effective, it must be set just the opposite of a price ceiling. It might be set above market price. So minimum price set below by law, and to be effective, it must be set above market price. Let's take it to the board. Draw home base for me once again. This is at least our 8th home base, I think, right? Yeah, we've done even more than that. We got the good old free market, allocating resources such that the equilibrium price is here at, let's say, $5. And the equilibrium quantity is at 1,000. And let's say that we're looking at the market for labor. Let's look at the labor market. And before you know it, there's an outcry by the public that says, are you kidding me? You can't live on $5 an hour? You can't raise a family working at Sonic with 3 kids making $5 an hour? That's an outrage. We got to have at least $7.25 to even have a chance of getting started. So they come in and pass along a floor price of $7.25. And principles of microeconomics students say, what? What's going to happen? A surplus. In the labor market, we even have a special name for that. What do we call it? Unemployed. Yeah, so we got unemployed. We have a surplus of labor. A surplus. In the labor market, these are unemployed people, people who would like to work but can't because there's not enough jobs. The quantity of jobs demanded. Now, I flipped on you. This is the resource market. So who's the demand curve, the businesses or the people, the households? The businesses are the ones wanting to hire labor. We'll come back to this at the very end of the term here. So remember, this is businesses that want to hire labor, and it's households that are supplying their labor services. And so the businesses would like to hire 800 people if they're forced to pay a $7.25 wage. And a lot of people get off the couch and start hunting for jobs, but they don't find them very fast. There's 1,200 people who would love to find a job at $7.25, but they can't, leaving with a surplus of labor of 400 people. We're measuring labor and people here. That's the effect of a price floor. All right, questions or comments there?
Is there any situation where floor price or ceiling price would be beneficial?
So the question was, is there any situation where a floor price or ceiling price would be beneficial? What do you think? Let me just throw that out to the crowd here. All right, so gas prices in the hurricane. So maybe it was important to throw in a price ceiling to not allow gas prices to go up. Of course, what does that mean? Even if the intentions were good to not hurt people further that are already hurt, did that mean nobody got hurt? We still have the shortage, right? So some people didn't get gasoline at all. Other people were able to get lesser expensive gasoline. So we still didn't quite balance out the equation. This is a QD. Yeah, for quantity demanded. Sorry, the question was what this Q was. QD for the quantity demanded. Okay, any other thoughts on whether it's good or bad? I mean, these end up being the facts. Yeah. Is this the government's way to trying to get equilibrium to move? So, again, not being able to jump into their minds, they might have had good intentions, like, let's try to get prices higher, minimum wage. If everybody just starts thinking that, hey, everybody deserves at least $7.25, the effects are still the same. So we still end up with some people getting a job. By the way, there's 800 people employed at $7.25, right? So some people picked up the benefit. In fact, we can analyze that, by the way. What's this little rectangle? I don't usually do this rectangle, but just to kind of get you thinking about welfare impacts. What's that little rectangle? It's not an equilibrium. It's people working. We got 800 people who were working that presumably would have been working at $5 an hour before, right? So now they're making $7.25. Those people have a big smile on their face. It's these people that have the not so big a smile, right? So if we can somehow, get people hurt that deserved it or something, do you think that's easy to, if we can make a policy so that only the really, really evil people are the ones that get affected here? I'm trying to be somewhat absurd to say that it's difficult to come up with one that would make sense. From an economist standpoint, I would say, what are you trying to achieve? Well, I'm trying to help out the workers. Look at this. And as an economist, I'd say, I got another idea, right? I want to help the worker too, but this is a stupid way of doing it. So yes, there might be some ways to make it a little easier pill to swallow, but better would probably be to scrap that and propose a different type of policy. And you guys are teeing me up perfectly for something I'm going to hit a little bit more on when Friday comes. Let's see, I saw your hand first.
Will the government ever impose a price floor to keep a company from monopolizing a market, from dropping their prices so low that other companies can't keep up with them?
Yeah, so typically they wouldn't use a price floor for that, but if we didn't, so to keep a company from charging $5 because they're trying to keep competition out and they have market power to do so. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say. And yes, that's a possible intent of doing it, but not something we see in the real world, that they wouldn't use that policy instrument. They would just take them to court probably on antitrust and try to unlock the barrier. Yeah.
You were talking about as an economist working for someone and they're trying to raise minimum wage because they think it's better for the people. You said there's a better way of doing that. What would be that way?
Well, I'll expand on that a little bit more, but the short of the answer is it's probably better to just give them money.
Okay.
Give the poor people some money that supplements this pay. So instead of giving everybody a $2.25 bump, let's find the person who's poor and just give that person the $2.25 difference.
Okay.
That's the gist of it. But I'll spend a little more time on that later. But that would be the idea.
What's another example of a price floor?
Agriculture is kind of a famous one. So the government steps in and says, oh, those poor farmers, the family farm is being crushed and corn prices at $5 is way too low. So let's do $7.25. Let's help out the farmers. So the intent here is to help out the suppliers. But that's not always what ends up happening, is what we're starting to see. Okay, price floor, price ceiling. Let me add the little note here on what we just said. Note. The intent is to help the producer, or in this case, the supplier, which is the household with the minimum wage. The intent is to help the producer, the supplier. But the real effect is to only help out those who get or actually receive the good, or in this case, parentheses, the job. 5 on our list. Regulations. Regulations. Number 5. Regulations. Supply, demand. Okay, so if the government passes stricter rules about the exhaust that can come out of your smokestack, if you're a producer, if it imposes new regulations on the accounting that you have to provide the public for a publicly traded company, they come up with a whole bunch of rules that require a lawyer and an accountant that are pretty high-level people charging about $200 an hour have to do that work, and you actually have to kind of start your own little accounting division. And then you also, to handle the smokestack deal, you have to have a professional, an environmentalist that really understands and can measure and quantify, and there's an engineer in there somewhere too that measures the actual smoke, the exhaust, the pollutants that are in that smokestack exiting the smokestack. What does that do to this? Boom, new regulations are imposed. What happens? Supply decreases, right? Now, one of our shifters was the cost of doing business, the price of resources. And so now you've just increased your labor cost, you've increased some other costs of doing business. And so the effect of the supply curve with regulations is really an increase in cost. And that is going to drive up the price with regulation, and the quantity with regulations are going to fall. Is there a wedge between what the producer receives and what the consumer pays? There's not. So this is different than a tax. Also, by the way, the government's not collecting any revenue with the regulation. It's kind of like the price floor in that sense. It was just passed along. So the regulation ends up driving prices up, ultimately passing some of those prices on to consumers, and then also passing them on to producers who now have a higher price. But as with anything, they're taking that higher price and having to pay their employees. Now it's the fancy engineer, the fancy lawyer, and the fancy accountant to handle all of the regulations. So their cost of doing business went up. Now, is that bad for society? What would make it not bad, or what's your thinking there?
Not bettering the air pollution.
Okay, so if we're bettering the air, and so if that air pollution is tied to the quantity being produced, then you can make an argument that the quantity should be lower from societies because they're not paying for the air. But now they're paying for the air effectively by having the engineer monitor it, adding devices and stuff that cleans the air before it gets thrown out into the environment. However, if there really isn't any pollution, or in the accounting side, any really substantial increase in the amount of information that the consumer is getting through having a book this thick of their financials and figures, right? The fancy lawyer and the fancy accountant. If all of that really is a bunch of hoops you're jumping, and then the consumer just says, "Oh, I got that report, honey, from our business. I'm just going to put this right on the shelf over here just in case we ever want to read up on all of those numbers that they got in there. Man, when we first bought the company 20 years ago, there used to just be 5 sheets, and it was pretty easy to flip through and get an idea about what's going on with the business, but now I don't have time to read all that." So did the regulation really help out in the end, or did it just drive up costs? Probably drove up costs. So that's where we get into this gray area, and we'll talk more about that towards the end of the semester again. We'll get back to some of the effects of regulation, but that's the idea of what would go on with regulation. All right, so on Friday, we will be working the worksheet in your packet. If you haven't printed these off, remember that I asked you to print them off. It's on My Econ Lab, the buckets and flows. There's about 20 pages, but the one specifically we're going to work on is this one on Friday. That's what we're going to start off with. So bring that to class with you. There's actually 2 pages. There's little instructions on the back.